I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane, broadcasting from the Marcus Garvey House here in North Minneapolis. And you know, it's all about the neighborhood. This is a conversation about how we build our community, our neighborhood, house by house, family by family. We're focusing on business creation, business development, economic development, and culture. It's a wonderful conversation, a robust conversation. One of the guides for this conversation is my brother, who takes us on a musical journey, Wayne McFarlane and jazz. Check him out.
In my room, I feel good when I'm thinking about my neighborhood.
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Chris Fields is running for the U.S. House of Representatives from the 5th District in Minnesota. Pleased to have him here today to talk about his candidacy, why he wants to serve you in that capacity. Joining me in questioning Chris Fields are two colleagues, elders in the community, Reverend Randolph Statton and Bill English, members of the Coalition of Black Churches and the African American Leadership Conference. I want to begin by inviting you, welcoming you, Chris Fields, and inviting you to take 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes to state the case. Why are you running? Who are you? And what do you want to do for the 5th District of Minnesota?
Sure. Well, thank you for the invite, gentlemen. My name is Chris Fields. Life for me started out being born to a 15-year-old mother in the South Bronx. My mother had 3 kids before she was 20 years old. We grew up poor, struggled quite a bit. We spent a lot of time in and out of social services places, welfare offices, and the like. But we managed to make it, and we made it by holding on to the things that made us whole, each other, our faith, and community. Sometime around 10 years old, my stepdad came into the picture, and things turned around for us a bit. Though he had no money, he was a long-haired, bushy, bearded white kid from the suburbs, but he had a dream and he had a passion. And that was to turn all the empty buildings in the South Bronx, at that time it looked like Beirut, he wanted to turn them into affordable low-income housing for the people in the neighborhood. And with just $3 and no money, never came for money, he was able to do that. He convinced the neighborhood folks that if they worked hard, they could own their own place. It was a self-help model. Today, that place is worth over $120 million in assets that they own or manage. And I believe in that self-help model. I believe in my dad and the good work that he's done. He still runs the community nonprofit. Since then, he's wrote a book. He's taught at Columbia University, put himself through law school. So he really is a hero and an inspiration to me. So when I took a look at the 5th Congressional District and saw the great need there was, especially here in the North Side, I thought that my 21 years experience as a combat veteran could be best put to service at the federal level. I understand the federal government. I understand what's available and how neighborhoods can take advantage of the resources that the federal government has and that government has. I do believe the government can be a force for good in people's lives. When I looked at the political scene here, what I saw was a lack of focus and a lack of attention. And what I would point out that in my 21 years in the Marines, I understood that when the United States wants something, when the federal government commits to something, it can happen. We have built cities out of absolutely nothing. We have toppled dictators. When we put our mind to something, and our energy, and our resources, it can happen. I want to bring those resources to bear, and that will. What I saw in my opponent was a lack of focus and a lack of attention. And so where he did not have the focus, I will bring that focus and leadership needed to move us forward.
Okay. Thank you for the opening statement. Reverend Statton and Bill English, any questions to start with? Go ahead.
Well, just the initial question, you mentioned that you knew something about the institution as far as the Capitol is concerned. Have you ever been involved in introducing any kind of legislation or getting anything through the Congress?
In my 21 years, we work with, I personally have worked with any number of politicians going back to when I was a private. I started out as an enlisted individual and later earned my commission. And we do have experience with the legislative branch, and that is to promote different products and ideas that we want and make sure that they get into legislation. Look, the Marine Corps is a service that prides itself on doing more with less. We do not have the great big budgets that the Air Force or the Navy has. So everything that we get, we must fight for. And sometimes those fights are political. Sometimes they can be accomplished with a handshake, sometimes a hammer, sometimes a smile, and sometimes a wink. So I do have experience at that level. Met with several ambassadors in my capacity overseas as a logistics officer. And so I understand personally how to get things done.
Specifically, what have you gotten done?
Specifically, when you take a look at the Marine Corps' deployment support systems, I was a lead subject matter expert on making sure that that program went from pen and paper to a fully automated and fully digital system. And so the model that we were trying to recreate was the FedEx model. Having been a career logistics man, I understand that transportation is the key to moving the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps doesn't have airplanes. We don't have ships. So how do we get from California to Iraq or to Japan? Well, there has to be a backbone behind that, and those are the programs that I have pushed to get us there faster and at less cost.
And that's in legislative areas, or that's just your management?
That is in legislative and in management areas, because you have to make sure that your program is authorized.
Mm-hmm. So you've done the work to have those programs legislated?
Absolutely. I was part of a team. Everything that we do in the Marines is teamwork.
Okay.
Who was the chief author on any of the legislation that you had
They were all
introduced?
part of the DoD authorization bills. And so what our job was to make sure that we get the programs that we want into those bills.
I'm bringing focus back to some issues that I'm very well aware that there's many people in the 5th District, particularly North Side, since a lot of what I've heard you talk about is the lack of focus on North Men. Tell me, where do you stand on the so-called Affordable Care Act, or better known as Obamacare? Mm-hmm. Where do you stand on that issue?
Sure. I believe that there are 3 components to health care, and that is access, quality of care, and affordability. I think that Obamacare, as it's known, and the president calls it Obamacare, addresses the access part. It does not address the quality of care. In other words, Obamacare isn't going to make your doctor better. Okay, that's quality of care. Okay, Obamacare isn't going to make it more affordable, because we've seen healthcare insurance premiums rise. Okay, so
Isn't that true? I think that's disingenuous, Mr. Fields, for us to talk about. In fact, that we've seen healthcare premium rise. We've seen healthcare premium rise under before Obamacare almost every year for the last 30, 25 years. Mm-hmm. The cost of healthcare is almost breaking our economy. So the question I want to ask is, you said it was twofold. Quality of care. The quality of care what's different about the Obamacare that when the United States clearly doesn't offer the best health care in the world? That's been over and over again stated. Matter of fact, we're in the teens as opposed to the best health care in the world. So that the quality of health care, in terms of that, while it doesn't address it directly, it does allow for choice. And so you can now, it does require people to post your outcomes. It does address outcomes. So it seems to me to get at that question. But more importantly, before we had it, you talk about the access issue. How do you address the problem of almost 50 million unemployed, uninsured people in America in healthcare, in the so-called the richest country in the world? How does one address that in the so-called private sector?
And so if you look at healthcare as an 800-pound elephant, what I would say is take one bite at a time. And let me give you for example. So some of the things that are in Obamacare are pretty popular. Mm-hmm. Keeping your kid on your insurance until he's 26, pre-existing conditions, and a lot of the free screenings that can happen with regard to Obamacare. But if you look at those free screenings, right, the mammograms and some of the other exams, if you added them up, it would take 7.4 hours of a physician's day, of a typical family practitioner. It would take 7.4 hours of his day just to complete the free screenings every single day with the number of physicians that the United States has. So to say that this thing has a lot of wonderful goodies in there, well, that's true, but guess what? We're not going to get every practitioner to cough up 7.4 hours of free time dedicated to doing all of these things, all of these various screenings. That's unrealistic. And so a lot of goodies in there, but when you look at the net effect, it becomes unrealistic and unmanageable. What I suggest with regard to healthcare is that you keep the things in there that are popular, okay? Keep them to the extent possible. And then what you do is allow for tort reform, okay? The Congressional Budget Office has said $54 billion could be saved in our medical system if we had tort reform. And then you allow for insurance across state lines. And then thirdly, what you do is let the states craft their own programs. In Minnesota, there's an advocacy group that's looking for a single payer system. Well, let them have it. If that's what Minnesotans want, let them have it. What works in Minnesota isn't going to work in Kentucky. It isn't going to work in St. Louis.
Mr. Fields, please do not give me that. That's gobbledygook. Let me be specific. We do not have the best healthcare in the world. So that's been acknowledged. Around the world, you go to France, you go to any place in the world, and many places in the world, not any place in the world, many places in the world, particularly in European countries and in Canada, and you walk in and you get healthcare and you don't get a bill. I asked you the question, how would you address the accessibility job? How would you make sure 44 million Americans can afford healthcare? Because that was the issue. Obama didn't fool anybody when he ran. He said healthcare was going to be his number one priority, and he did, and he got it passed after 40 years of people trying to do that. So tell me how you would ensure under the private sector healthcare for 44 million poor people.
Well, Medicaid takes care of folks who can't afford it. And then for seniors, there's Medicare. And so the rest of the people...
on their own.
Excuse me?
On their own?
No, it's not on their own. When they go to work, they can negotiate their health care cost. What I would like to see ultimately is health care disassociated from work, and so that individuals are free to go out there and purchase the health care that they need. And so that the business gives them the check. And that's already started to happen, as a matter of fact. Darden Restaurants, which owns Olive Garden, Sears, has already said, hey, folks, we are going to give you a check and you're going to go ahead and purchase your own insurance. One of the problems with Obamacare is that the penalty for an employer to not carry insurance is $2,000, okay, for an employer that has 51 employees or more. Okay, some employers are paying $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 for their employees' health insurance. We just gave them a big incentive to say, okay, no more insurance for you. I'll pay the $2,000 fine, and now put them into a state exchange. And what kind of care you have access to at that state exchange is really up to the states. So I think the incentives in Obamacare are a little bit off.
Reverend Stadden, a question.
Yeah, very simple question. There is a voter ID, the constitutional amendment that's on the ballot this time. What's your position on it?
I support voter ID, and I support voter ID for a number of reasons. As a veteran, as an African American, I see it as a way to keep the integrity in our electoral process. And what I would add, in addition to that, is, on the other side of the political spectrum, call it the gun rights guys, they have long since acquiesced and said, hey, you know what, there should be some reasonable restrictions with regard to gun ownership. Something reason, so that the 5-day waiting period, I have a constitutional right to bear arms, okay? But I have to submit myself to a 5-day waiting period.
What does that have to do with the voter ID?
Let me tie it together.
Okay.
And so that if I say, you know what? It makes sense to have a 5-day waiting period because, of course, we don't want felons and we don't want mentally ill people walking around carrying guns. Then I'm going to apply that same sort of make sense logic to voter ID. And voter ID to me makes sense. And when you look at the number of things that you have to have, number of things you have to do to have with an ID card, this is just a next step in that process.
Is there a history of voter fraud that this remedies?
I don't know that it's a matter of a history of voter fraud.
Or, on the other hand, is this an intentional effort to deprive a segment of the population, to discourage a segment of the population, and to minimize the capacity of a segment of the population to participate in the electoral process? That's the allegation from the other side.
Sure, and what I would tell them is this. So are we saying that we're comfortable with folks not being able to open up a bank account? Are we comfortable with folks not being able to access certain services because they don't have a government
That's
ID?
like saying, are you comfortable with having a requirement that you have to guess how many beans are in the jelly jar in order to vote? That's the equation I'm getting from this. It's another way to limit and to discourage or to marginalize people for a certain point of view, for somebody's advantage.
For somebody who doesn't have a government ID card. And what I would say is we can't be comfortable allowing those folks to live out there on the fringe, because indeed you are living on the fringe if you do not have a government ID card. You cannot drive, you cannot access certain services. You can't get your own mail without a government ID card.
Let me just say, I guess I'd like to hear something a little more from you. I'm actually insulted by this action in terms of having a voter's ID and the motivation for it, since there is almost zero fraud that occurs, so there's not a problem to be fixed. And since Minnesota has the most open, best voting system in the country that has been admired, until in fact folk wanted to deprive African Americans of and other people of color of their right to vote. That was the initial target and reason and rationale for it.
I can't speak to the motivations of people, and I don't speak to the motivations of people, the legislators who crafted the legislation and put it on the ballot. What I will speak to is the fact that I believe that it is reasonable to ask people to possess a government ID card.
Why
I
would
mean, just to have a government ID card, you open up the door to so many services. And I cannot believe that we are in a position where we have strong opposition to people having a government ID card. I mean, it's a passport of some sort.
It's a matter of choice. If a 91-year-old lady who lives in a senior citizen tower right from here now, who quit driving 20 years ago, doesn't need it, who has her own income, doesn't have check, gets deposited by Social Security right into her bank account. She's had a bank. She hasn't had a state-issued ID in 15 years. Doesn't feel she need one, but she's voted in every election. She doesn't want to stand in line any place to get a state-issued voter ID, even though she could afford. Why should she be required one when all of these years she's been able to vote without having it, and there is no fraud? It seems to me a solution without a problem. And if someone wants to vote a state ID, they should be able to get it, but it shouldn't be a requirement for exercising the constitutional right to vote.
Let's move on to the other amendment on the ballot, and that is the marriage amendment. What's your position on that?
That is a vote of.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure.
Are you a Republican? Because I'm looking at the information here, and I don't see any identification with party at all. And I know that politically, we always identified as somewhere. Are you a candidate of the Republican Party?
I am the endorsed Republican candidate. Yes.
Okay. Why don't you have it on the end of your leadership?
Because, as I alluded to earlier in a previous conversation, Look, I'm part of the next generation of combat veterans who came back home and said, look, it's for us, party is not the central identification. It's not a matter to me of who's right. It's a matter of what's
the
right.
Republican Party, and are you ashamed to let people know that you're endorsed by the public?
Absolutely not.
There are two parties running in this race. Is it my understanding a Republican and a Democrat?
That is correct.
Okay. Well, are you attempting to in any way deceive the public as a result of not putting Republican on your leadership?
Absolutely not, because when they look at the ballot, they're going to see that big R in front of my name. And I get the fact that some people will not be able to pull the trigger or circle a bubble for someone with that R in front of their name. And I would submit that that's a certain prejudice that needs to be ended.
It's a prejudice for certain people to disagree with a party that has, in very recent years, voted against the interest of 80 and 90% of African Americans. I mean, it seems to me if I wore the mantle of a Republican, and there are good Republicans, Colin Powell's a great man. He challenged his party on things like affirmative action. I assume that I won't make any assumption. You could state where you stand on that. He's challenged the party on that. But even moreover, in terms of issues like the immigration issues that Arizona and others has done to deny people the right to come to this country. And all of these issues that are against the interests of poor people and people of color. I'm really concerned that we need to know where you stand on those issues, immigration.
I don't know that a single party can hold the in this country can hold the mantle of being for minorities or for the poor. And what I would point out to, and you gentlemen may recall the day that he said it, it was a Democrat who said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation always. And so that historically speaking, I don't believe that any party can hold a mantle. What I believe is politics at the end of the day. The Democrats do what's most expedient for them at the time, and the Republicans do the same. Now, am I more closely aligned in legislative philosophy to the Republican Party? Absolutely. In this regard, I believe that the best solutions to problems are found at the state and local level. I also believe that the federal government is just too big right now and it is too sloppy. And I've seen it for 21 years as a Marine.
So
and the Republican
you would advocate sort of a regression to the states' rights era, and you would advocate and work for a return to the era of states' rights, where states could decide what things can happen within their jurisdictions. An era that I think legalized and operationalized the consistent disenfranchisement of black people.
Now, I didn't
From
say
my
that.
point of view, I'm saying that. So,
Okay, and I think that there are things that are appropriate for states to handle. In fact, President Obama himself, when he came out in support of gay marriage, said, but that's a state's issue. Okay, there are some issues that the states are better equipped to handle. For example, Medicaid.
Let me ask for one last question. We've got about 2 minutes to finish up here. A brief question, and then I want you to have a summary statement. Sure.
What's the major problem that I understand? I look at a lot of literature. I used to be in politics myself. That you're saying some negative things about the current congressman here, that he's taking money and dealing with corrupt politicians like Charlie Ringel and just on the gravy train. What do you have to support that kind of allegation?
What I would say is this: it's a matter of focus. And I believe right now that Minneapolis is a place that, for a lot of folks, they're doing okay. But we have pockets of hardcore poverty here, okay? Now, when you're in Ohio, just like both presidential candidates are, going crisscrossing around that state, and what are they talking about? The automobile industry. When you're in Minneapolis, the thing that you should be talking about and the thing that you should be focused on is the north side, because by 2050, if I may, by 2050, the United States is a 51% minority. We have the largest achievement gap in education between black and whites and the largest unemployment gap. That affects every single citizen, and if we don't fix them, we'll be, the whole city will hurt.
Last question, Bill.
I would
Briefly,
say-
please.
I was asked you simply the question: how do you, as a Republican, address the issue of poverty in terms of the poor people in this country? And as a candidate, what would you do to end poverty?
Sure, and what I've asked for and what I've promoted and had many conversations with legislators about is a federal enterprise zone. And in that federal enterprise zone, I believe that we can do things like step up our enforcement of laws on the books with regard to minority hiring and small business contracting. I believe that we can have a no tax zone for small businesses that could extend so as to let our small businesses grow up. We need to become an opportunity society again.
Chris, down to the last minute, closing
Sure.
statement, 1 minute.
Look, I'm looking for people to support my campaign because I will bring focus on the two problems that plague us the most here in Minneapolis. We have the largest unemployment gap between black and whites in the entire country. Unemployment is 17.7% amongst blacks, and that's unacceptable. I will work every single day to close that gap, and I'll work every single day to close the achievement gap and give our children a chance for the future.
Chris Fields, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Love to.
Join us again for a conversation with the other candidate for 5th District, Keith Ellison. We'll see you in a minute. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. Welcome back. This part of the program, we continue our discussion about the 5th District of Minnesota, speaking to the incumbent, Congressman Keith Ellison. Keith, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
And we want to talk to you about your campaign, your priorities, but I want to start with giving you 4 minutes or so to state the case. Why should voters return you to Washington?
Thanks for asking me the question. Also, thank you, Mr. English, Mr. Staton. Appreciate you guys coming together. Well, here's the thing. The American working class, American middle class, has been on a 30-year downward slide. We've seen wage stagnation. We've seen union membership drop off. And we've seen the average working American see their economic fortunes slide. Well, this hasn't happened by accident. This is about offshoring. This is about attacking unions. This is about disinvesting in public infrastructure involving schools, healthcare, and a whole range of things. We've seen an increase in tuition because the state appropriation for colleges has been going down. So students borrow more, tuition goes up. So how do we stop this? Well, in 2006, when I went to Congress, we did some real important things to stop it. We passed the Credit Card Holders Bill of Rights, meaning that banks that used to monkey around with people's credit cards couldn't do it. I had a major bill in there that was my own bill that said that if you have more than one credit card and the credit card and you have late on one, on time on the other, that they could not jack you up on the one you were on time on. But then there's so much more than that. We saw the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act. We saw in Congress, we reduced the crack cocaine disparity from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1. Now, it's not good enough, but it's the right direction. We've seen the middle class and the working classes of America get historic health care. Some people say they want to get rid of it on the first day. Yet, we're about to be able to cover 32 million Americans. And and there's a whole range of things that people's lives are just going to be better already going on. And then we pass the Dodd-Frank bill, which has for the first time a consumer financial protection bill, and the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, even though Republicans would not even confirm, the director has already started suing banks that have engaged in historic racial discrimination and just general unfairness with regard to mortgage lending. So we have seen that long slide downward for the American working people and middle class people begin to have a dip upward between 2006 in 2010. But then we hit a wall in 2010. People didn't show up to vote, and Republicans took back over. And what did they do? They started trying to take away Obamacare. They started trying to take away, we for the first time, we made it so that we were really regulating Wall Street again. No more Madoffs who made off with the money and all that. But now they want to put all that stuff back in place. It didn't take them 2 years. I mean, they're right back at it. And then they said that their main goal is to get rid of Obama, not put America back to work. We had the American Jobs Act. They won't even take the bill up. They won't even allow us to debate the American Jobs Act and stuff that'll put Americans back to work. And then, I think the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, so-called stimulus, hey, it paid for the bridge that we go over in Plymouth Avenue, paid for the bridge up in Lowry. I mean, and a whole bunch of, it's doing good things for people on the ground. Republicans have no respect for it, didn't vote for it. But what I'm saying is, this country needs to have a big middle class full of people of color, full of people who are working hard, full of new Americans. And yet, these folks are working all day and night to try to stop that. They're even trying to take our vote away. My campaign has been devoted to defeating photo ID. When they first wheeled it out, 80% of Minnesotans said they would vote for it. Last poll said 51, because the more Minnesotans hear about it, the less they like about it. And we're gonna beat this thing, So this is why I'm running, because we want freedom and justice for all, the right to vote, the right to have an economic future for you and your family, the right to go to the doctor. This is what we're fighting for, and this is what I will go back and fight for.
Translate some of the policies you've worked on, bills you passed, into direct benefit for your district.
Yeah,
you mentioned the bridge. You mentioned this bridge. I know you did ARRA. Our company was involved with the broadband access project,
Yep.
a great project. But tell me what other things are direct, specific consequences of your legislation, your work.
Right, because I could tell you how I've supported big pieces, and I have, and my help was really necessary on several parts of it. But let me talk about bills that I authored, that I brought to fore, and I passed. One is a bill I recognize in our district, here on the north side where I live, by the way, and all four of my kids were raised here. I noticed that a lot of people who are suffering from foreclosure were not landlords, or homeowners, but tenants. People who rented, their landlord couldn't pay the mortgage, and then they end up out of luck. So I passed a bill and got it through the House, through the Senate, and the President signed it, in which it said that you gotta have 90 days after the date of foreclosure before the tenants have to leave. Now the banks didn't want it, and they fought it, and they said, you're restricting us to do what we want. But now they don't complain about it. You know why? Because there's somebody living in that property. And it's like, well, it's better than just abandoning it, and then everybody strip all the copper out of it. That's a bill, that's my bill. The other bill that I talked about was in the Credit Card Holders Bill of Rights. It was a freestanding bill, but then a person who has higher seniority than I did swept the bill up in a larger bill. This is the bill I talked about with universal default. This bill says that if you got a credit card and you got more than one, they cannot take adverse action against you unless you are late on that credit card. And then another very important bill I'm real proud to be a part of is getting money for Summit Academy. That's a bill. When you bring an appropriations bill, you have to pass it through. Summit Academy, we got them $400,000. American Indian OIC for workforce development, we got them a similar amount. NEON, which is a Northside organization, we got them $150,000 so that they could do small business lending. The African American Museum, we got $250,000 for that. And so there's some other bills like the targeted case management bill that I introduced that really helped save about $135,000 for Hennepin County. Not to mention the gunshot detection system, which is a bill I got that system funded here. So I've been real busy passing legislation and appropriation bills directly focused on the north side of Minneapolis. So when I hear people take after me, on this, I'm always confused because I'm like, wow, I don't need GPS to find North Minneapolis. I know where it is. I live here. And if you're talking about it all the time, maybe you should come over here and at least mentor one kid. And so, but I've devoted my life to not just North Minneapolis, but for the whole of Minneapolis, the whole of the state of Minnesota, in the United States.
Mr. Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Representative. It's good to see you here. Thank you.
Man, as our trailblazer pioneer.
Let me ask one question though, and I'm sure that all of us are at least concerned about it. In 1998, we listed a 10-point plan of the issues affecting the African American community.
I remember well.
Right, and we are now 14 years later, but the first item on that plan dealt with the problem of concentrated, persistent poverty among African Americans in the Twin Cities areas was among the top 25 cities in America.
Yeah.
Number one among the 25 cities in America. Now this year, we get a report that comes from the Economic Policy Institute that look at Minnesota joblessness, and it points out that African Americans at 17.7% is the highest in the United States of America. We have overall unemployment at about 5.2, 5.3% right now, among the best in America overall, but African Americans are still at 17% among the worst in America. Yep. How do you look at that, and what do you see that needs to happen for that?
Well, the way I look at those statistics is that they keep me up at night. They're the reason I ever went into politics. They're the reason I was an activist and working with you gentlemen over the years. They're the reason why I really have spent my life trying to do public service. But here's the thing about it. There's a map, a zoning map in 1935, which said it had a circle around North Minneapolis, and you know what it wrote in that circle? Negro slum. There has been historic disinvestment in this community for decades and decades. Now here's the reality. If it took decades, if it was this way in 1935, it can change, but it does take the arms and the efforts of many people. Now, I think that we have reason to be hopeful in North Minneapolis. And why is that? Because now we have focused attention on really solving the problem. Do we have enough? No, we don't. But it's easy to read a news article and talk about, oh, the statistics are bad, therefore it must be your fault. But the truth is that we need all hands. Now here's a few things that I think are good and heading us in the right direction in North Minneapolis, and we got more things that we should and could do. Foreclosure hit us hard. I was a key co-sponsor on the Neighborhood Stabilization Act, NSA, that allowed us to buy about 135 homes here on the north side so that landlords didn't just scoop them up, speculators, and then we put families back in them. This has allowed the foreclosure rate to pretty much level off in North Minneapolis, and we're getting families back in those places right now. Heritage Park, which all of us know very well, that's the largest investment in North Minneapolis since probably the 1930s. As you know, when the NAACP and the legal aid sued the city, HUD and the city, it was for historic tracking. To the credit of the people who were in office, they said, yeah, absolutely, this discrimination happened, but why don't we have a real investment now? And so, Heritage Park, if you go through it, it's nice, it's up to snuff, it represents the first real investment in North Minneapolis in so long. And so if you get housing in place, we still have to continue to invest in jobs in North Minneapolis. I think investing, yeah.
And I hear you, and I trust you.
Yeah.
Let me say that first. But we still have to make sure that there are some things that are directed that would directly reach this particular community here. Because part of what's happening here is that we have jobs that's happening for Minnesota, but so often they are not reaching the black community. And it's not just a question as far as education is concerned,
Right.
because you have folk who are black and educated and still unable to get employment and so forth.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
discrimination is a reality as
Right.
well. I mean, I don't want to ignore that. I mean, we still have real discrimination. And so, I mean, but let me tell you, when I go to meet, I have several roundtables, and we talk to the financial services roundtable. We talk about this particular reality at that roundtable. We got the big banks around the table. What are you going to do about it? And so we're taking it there, and we've been in touch with MnDOT, organized several meetings with MnDOT about minority inclusion. And, you know, but I haven't done it alone. I've had minority contractors around the table helping to bring pressure to bear on these institutions. Look, you've been in office, so have I. Al's run a newspaper and Bill's volunteered over here and run a school over here. We do it because we know the problems are deep-seated and persistent. But the people who are helping to solve the problem need more help. They don't need people kicking the legs under them. And what I'm saying is, you know, yeah, we need some specific solutions. That's why I worked hard for workforce development money at Summit OIC, because they're in a position to do skills up training. So they're turning out carpenters. You know, if you got Lewis King here, he would tell you, we've been the partner that helps them get the money they need to help young African Americans do everything from solar panel training, windmill training. And then I don't want to leave the conversation before I talk about North Star Commuter Rail and Central Corridor, because part of the solution, not all of it, is making sure that we're not transportationally isolated as we have been, so that we can get out to job centers. We now are in a situation where you can live in North Minneapolis, get downtown, get on a train to anywhere you want to go. And we got Bottineau that we're working on that's going to go in the northwest direction, southwest in the southwest direction, and more to come.
Bill, English.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Congressman, and appreciate your work. But I'm struck by something, Reverend, and I know we keep talking about the middle class.
Yeah.
What I don't hear, and I think maybe what was at the underpinning of Reverend Statton's comment, was that, politically it's easy to talk about the middle class.
Yeah.
What's not politically easy is to talk about poor people and how we can move poor people. And the only way that's going to happen is jobs.
No doubt.
You know, as Lewis likes to say, well-paying, living wage jobs.
Right.
Qualified by saying that. The question that I'm raising is, how can the next Congress do more to get at this infrastructure issue which could put people to work? And more important, why can't we talk more about that as an issue, as from a political standpoint, that when Romney talks about he's going to create 12 million new jobs, he's not talking about how he's going to create them, and we certainly not talking about investing in infrastructure given his budget. But what can our party do to really talk about how we force the hand to, that bridge fell down once, you have to get money to save lives, because we got hundreds of bridges around this country. I'm of the
1,500 in the state of Minnesota.
Okay, so what can this Congress do, with or without the president's support, to really move this country towards some way of dealing with the infrastructure, which is a way of creating living wage jobs?
No doubt, you're right about that. Let me just tell you this about talking about the poor versus the middle class. My experience, when I knock doors all over this community and all over this city, you go into some of the poorest folks' homes, and they do not self-identify that way a lot. You know, so when I talk about the people who actually are poor, I usually talk about the working class. Okay. Now, if you're too young to work, too old to work, or too sick to work, then, you know, you're poor. But that we should have systems in place to make sure the people can make it. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, food stamps, all that. But most people who are not too poor, too young, or too sick to work, they would love to be middle class and working, but our society has not done what it needs to do to produce the number of jobs. So when I'm talking about this issue, I mean, I use the term working class prosperity a lot. And what I mean is that, okay, you want to make sure that you're earning a living, you want an opportunity, you're not working now, but you'd like to be. Rather than me coming at you from the standpoint of deficit and what you don't have, let's talk about what you could have if this society was working for you. Now, so that's why I talk about these issues this way. Let me then turn to, look, the first thing folks got to do is realize that elections have consequences. You know, I think I learned that from you, Randy. Elections matter, elections count. The reason we haven't had the kind of bill you imagine, Bill, and me too, is that the Republican Tea Party Congress has stood in the way of the American Jobs Act. You can't pass a bill unless you get it through one house, then the other, and the president signs it. That they have said that they want to cut, they don't want any infrastructure investment. I mean, okay, let's just talk about the one infrastructure bill we did pass, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. You know, 75% of that bill was tax cuts. Most of it wasn't infrastructure. Why wasn't it so much of it not infrastructure? Because in the Senate, we needed Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins. We needed their vote. And you know what they said the price of their vote was? Cut out the school reinvestment portion. Schools all over this country, kids freezing in there, boiler breaking down, roof leaky, windows creaky, and they say cut that part out.
But Congressman, that's just the point. That's been my point of raising. I know where you stand on the issue.
Oh, yeah.
But until people stand up and tell it from a leadership position, till congressmen and senators stand up and tell it, and I'm not just bringing this to you.
Yeah.
I said it to Franken. I said it to Amy. They need to stand up and tell it. They need to challenge the faith community, black, white, or whatever color, to address this issue in ways in which the people can understand it. Because many people, I do not believe 90% of Americans vote against their self-interest. But they have been so bamboozled.
They don't know.
They don't know.
Well, like they're told that their problem is some gay people.
Yeah.
Their problem is that the guns.
Yeah.
Their problem is some Mexicans.
Yeah.
Their problem is the food stamp president. You know what that is.
Before you speak to the vote, you mentioned it earlier in your opening statement, with the voter ID amendment.
Yeah.
That's a big issue, and it sounds reasonable
It's the most
that
fundamental
every
issue.
American should have a government ID. But I raised the question earlier, is there something behind this different from that simple idea of having an ID? What do you say to that?
It's raw, naked, power grab. That's all it is. I mean, here's the thing. Yeah, it'd be nice if everybody had an ID, but why would you tie that to their vote? Why would you say they can't vote unless they get one? It is nothing but an effort to try to gain an advantage in an election. That's all it's about.
And the objective is what?
Well,
You
to
don't
slice.
vote, then what happens?
Well, then, like I just said, elections have consequences. You start slicing out young people, you slice out older, senior citizens in nursing homes, you slice out low-income people who haven't had an ID. I mean, this rap that they say, well, why don't you want everybody to have an ID? Well, it's fine to get an ID, no problem. They should be free, but they shouldn't be tied to whether or not you have the franchise. We have a perfectly running, in fact, the best election system in the country, and they don't like that, and they feel they can do better if they cut some people down. Remember, the last election in this state was settled by 8,700 votes. And the election before that was settled by 312 votes. What if you don't have to cut out, like we're a state of 5 million. What if you cut out 1%? That's 50 million. What if you cut out 1/10 of 1%? You could shift an election with that, and that is what this is all about.
Last question, Randy.
I guess I need to say something. I had two questions, but I'm going to just have one. I know we got time. But my concern is that the voter suppression is nicely covered up it is absolutely the most bigoted thing that can happen in this country, period.
No doubt.
When you start talking about overturning the Voting Rights Act, when you start talking about assault on me because I am black and I might vote for somebody else, that is absolutely dangerous.
Yes.
And part of my concern was that even in the state of Minnesota, if we said 87% of the people were going to support it, and so we may back off in terms of supporting it, and then we find out that we ended up supporting it, and now we have a tight margin. My concern is that we needed to have acted earlier. I wouldn't care if it was 90%. We needed to make sure that voting rights is a fundamental thing that we will always fight for.
Well, brother, you should be proud to know that my campaign has not even put getting me reelected as the top line.
Right.
We have put vote no in the top of our scripts. And let me tell you how many people we've called. It's really spectacular. We have called 600,000 people who live in the 5th Congressional District. We have knocked on or called 600,000 people, and we've had direct conversations with about 20% of them, and they're calling like mad right now. We have made defeating photo ID our top line issue, and we have enlisted Take Action to help us. And you know, I mean, just this weekend, we were at a rally, Reverend McAfee was there, Labor was there. I'm telling you, we're gonna beat this thing, but we need to keep it up. And you know, we gotta understand, you know, when the devil comes back, he's not gonna be red-skinned and 2 horns and a tail. He's gonna have a nice suit, he's gonna talk real sweet, he's gonna sound so reasonable. And just like this thing sounds reasonable. Oh, what's wrong with having an ID? Well, nothing. But why should it be tied? Why should I lose my right to vote if I don't have one?
We're down to our last minute closing statement, Representative Ellison.
Well, we have a lot at stake in this election. And what's at stake is literally our quality of life as Americans, as Minnesotans, as people who live in the 5th District. What we need now more than ever is activism. The time for action is now. And so I'm asking folks, if you believe that going to the doctor is something everybody should enjoy, you gotta be out here voting. If you believe that you want the right to vote to be protected and not have a bunch of paperwork, you gotta get out here. If you believe that you ought to be able to buy a house and not get ripped off, or somebody in the government ought to be looking after you a little bit, then you need to be out here in this election. If you believe we need to invest in workforce and infrastructure, you got to be out here. So we're trying to urge people, get out here, take a stand, make a difference in your own life. Don't sit on the sideline. We need more volunteers.
Thank you so much. Representative Keith Ellison, thank you. My colleagues, Reverend Randy Statton, Mr. Bill English, representatives of the Coalition of Black Churches and the African American Leadership Summit. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. Remember, you make a difference, vote. Thank you.
Good afternoon to you, and we'll catch you next Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. Don't be late. name is Wayne Anthony McFarlane, and you've been listening to Conversations with Al McFarlane. KFAI.org. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We got to say goodnight. We want to thank Al McFarlane for bringing us all those great words and all our lovely guests, all the guests in the house. Everything's good, and So I want y'all to tune in every Tuesday morning, right around 9 o'clock. Cause we're gonna play you a song. All the guests will be home. We'll be feeling like talking, have a robust conversation. All our guests in the house, 2 million people out there. I know you're listening on the internet, KFAI. Come on, listen to the show. Come on, Al McFarlane gonna let you know. Cause this thing he said, the message is clear. Everybody